Hi, it's Rob from the Bush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint Laurens de Graaf, the Blood and Plunder legendary commander. Okay, so this is the model for Laurens de Graaf, who was a Dutch pirate who is working with the French. Not a nice fella, but really cool miniature. So we're going to start painting him using Citadel Mecrag blue. I'm going to use this to do his shirt. Now he's Dutch, and the Dutch had the red, white and blue on their flag, and the French have the tricolour, although they didn't at the time Laurens was around. So we are just going to do this so that he has a bit of the blue, white and red on his clothing, which kind of symbolises those two flags, although as I say, they didn't have the tricolour in France when he was alive. Next up, we're going to use a little bit of vallejo white. I'm going to use this on his cuffs and his open chest shirt at the front there. As I say, if you don't play Blood and Plunder, but you like to look at the miniatures and you're interested in some of the history behind them as well, it's worth having a look online at some of the history behind some of these pirates that I'll be painting up over the next few weeks. Some of them are quite interesting. This fella was quite the horrible chap, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. As I say, quite a horrible chap, very successful pirate, but not the nicest of guys. So we're going to do his skin using Citadel Kislev flesh. I'm trying to base the colours a little bit of him from what you can find online there. So it's saying he had blonde hair and moustache. So I'm figuring with the blonde hair he's probably maybe a little bit more pale skinned. So we're using this lighter skin tone rather than the Cadian flesh tone that we usually use. Or indeed the vallejo flesh base, which is another one of my favourites. So with that done, we're going to go on to Citadel Rakkarth flesh. I'm going to use this to paint his hair. Use this as the basis for blonde hair. And I'm painting them up, so give that a good coat of the Rakkarth flesh. And once you're done, we can move on to the next colour. Like so. Next up, we're going to use some Citadel Baneblade brown. I'm going to use this to paint the floorboards and also the leather belt, parts of his scabbard there. It is quite an interesting colour to start with. It's very light, very pale. With a few washes you can get that looking really nice. Get it having that nice kind of yellowy brown deck colour. Once you've finished doing those parts, we can go on to the next bit. So we're going to use the red, which is the final colour of the tricolour. We're going to use this to do his sash. Also the band on his hat as well. Going to give that a nice little red band and then a sort of more crimson, kind of deeper red feather coming out the top of his hat there too. So we're going to do that feather using Citadel Khorne Red. Just give that a nice coat of that. You can see some more red chaps in the background there and some really old Nurgle miniatures. You can also see the really bad spraying of the undercoat on his legs there too. Once you're happy with that, you can move on to the next colour. I'm going to move on to Citadel Baneblade brown again. I'm actually going to paint up the belt and bits of his scabbard now. So if you did this earlier on when you painted the floorboards, you're safe, you can just skip through this part. If you didn't paint it earlier on, then no problem, we can paint it up now. Next up, we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Dryad bark. I'm going to use this to paint the handles of the two pistols which he's got tucked into his sash. Once you've given them a decent coat of the Dryad bark, we can move on to the next colour with that. Like so. Next up, we're going to use some vallejo black. I'm just going to reapply this to his hat, his trousers and his shoes, just to give them that nice matte colour of the cloth. Sorry about this, there does seem to be a little bit more focus than usual on the figures behind. I do try and correct that shortly, but it does keep happening here. As long as you're getting the black applied to the hat, the trousers and the shoes, you can't go wrong. So with them done, we're going to go to Vallejo Ivory. I'm going to use this to do his stockings. Give them a decent colour. You might need to put 2 layers on it. This is quite a thin colour. So if you're finishing it's quite streaky, just go back and put another coat on. You should be fine with that. Once you've applied that and got the nice smooth ivory colour on his stockings, we can move on to the next one. Now we're going to do some of the gold, which is just going to be for a few little pieces of his scabbard, just to give them a bit of colour, and also the hilt and guard on his sword. Like so. Now I'm going to use Citadel Leadbelcher just to do the blade of his sword. If you want to, you can also do the bolts on the planks on his base as well if you want to do, but you can do them a bit later on too, so there's no rush to do them. Also going to do just a few little details on his pistols too. Now I'm going to start with the shades. I'm going to start with the skin using Citadel Rightland Flesh Shade. So the problem here is I've failed to zoom in on the figure, so you're getting a lot more of the background than you should be, so apologies for that. Once you've shaded the skin, we can move on to the next shade. Next up, we're going to use some Citadel Cassandora Yellow. I'm going to use this to go over the Rakarth flesh of his hair. This gives that kind of slightly yellowish tint to the blonde hair, which is fine. Now we're going to use some Citadel Seraphim Sepia, very swiftly shown there. I'm just going to use this to paint his stockings, give them that slightly more off-white colour. Like so. That's going to be some Citadel Drakenhof Nightshade. We're using this to paint onto his shirt. So make sure you get all that into the recesses to get them darkened up. Once you've got that shade applied, we can move on to the next colour. Like so. Now it's going to be Citadel Carrowbird Crimson. I'm going to use this for the Khorne Red feather that we did on his hat. Like so. Now a bit of Citadel Druchii Violet. We're going to use this for the little bit of bandana he's got under his hat, the sash on his waist, and also the band on his hat too. I always find that the shades is the part where the details really come out on the miniature. So while it looks quite bland with just the base colours, you add the shades and you really do get that detail showing through. Starts looking good. So now I'm going to use some Citadel Contrast Snakebite Leather. I'm going to use this to paint the scabbard for his sword and the little bits of his belt that you can see hanging down from under his sash. A very quick layer there. Next shade is going to be Citadel Nuln Oil. I'm going to use this just to do the blade of his sword. Just will dull it down a bit and give it that kind of dirty look. Like so. Finally, we're going to use some Citadel Apothecary White just to go over the white areas that we've painted on him. I should add, there seems to be a bit of video missing here. We should have had Citadel Agrax Earthshade just to paint over the 2 sections of gold, or the 3 sections of gold. So if you've got Agrax Earthshade to hand, just do that over the guard and parts of the hilt of his sword, and also the little bits on his scabbard and the buttons on his shirt. So now we're going to start reapplying the colour. We're going to start with Citadel Macragge Blue. I'm going to start reapplying the colour to his shirt. So here you want to be making sure that you leave the shade in the recesses on a miniature, and just applying the Macragge Blue to the bits that will be catching the light. So on the underside of his arms, you don't want to be going too far under with the Macragge Blue, because you want to be giving that impression of darkness under there. There will be a certain amount of natural shade from his arm, but you can emphasise that a little bit by leaving some more of the shade underneath his arm. Next up, we're going to mix a little bit of white with the Macragge Blue. We're going to do the first highlight on his shirt. With this layer, you don't want to be doing anything on the other side of the arms or anything like that. You are using it just to highlight the main areas where the light will be catching him. Crests of all the creases on his shirt. You want to make sure that you're getting the highlights on there. As with the shades and the base layer back on, that'll really give them quite a bit of definition, make them stand out where it's catching the light. And also emphasise the crease on the shoulders of his, where the sleeve joins the main body of his shirt too. So now we're going to add a little bit more white to the previous mix. And we're going to highlight this once more of an extreme highlight, so you just want to be doing thin highlights atop all the crests and the tops of everywhere where you would be getting the light catching it. With this you can really make the shirt look as though it's got those creases standing out and the light is catching the edge of those creases. Once you've finished that, we can move on to the next colour. Now we're going to return to Citadel Khorne Red. I'm going to start working on the feather on his head there. So on this you want to be thinking about how the feather looks. You're going to have the main kind of central part of the feather running down the middle. Having difficulty focusing on the miniature there. And then you're going to have the little piece of feather coming off that central point. So you want to make sure that you get that central point painted on there first, and then you know where you're going to be drawing those lines on. We're going to highlight those areas using Citadel Wazdakka Red. Cat saying hello there. You want to be highlighting the areas that you've just put on, making sure that you leave the Carrowbird Crimson in the recesses and also some of the Khorne Red showing beneath the Wazdakka Red, as you are doing this as the first of the highlights. Once you've finished those highlights, it's on to the next colour. So the final height we're doing on the feather is going to be using a little bit of Citadel Pink Horror. We're only going to be doing some extreme highlights on this, so you don't want too much paint on your brush. You just want to be catching a few of those little raised areas to give that one final little highlight. like so. Next colour is going to be Citadel Mephiston Red. I'm going to reapply the colour to his bandana, the band on his hat, and also the sash around his waist. Now you want to make sure that you get the larger areas of this painted with the Mephiston Red, just making sure that you leave some of that druchy violet in the recesses on the sash and the various other areas you're painting. That'll give them the nice shade, while picking the raised areas out with Mephiston Red will give them that nice brighter colour. When you finish with this colour, we can move on to the next. So with the Mephiston Red done, we're now going to use a little bit of Citadel Evil Sunz Scarlett. There's kind of a nice orangey red. So it does separate the Khorne Red and the Mephiston Red quite nicely. So you have an orangey red for his sash and a band on his hat, and then you've got that kind of maroony pinkish red for the feather coming out the top of his hat. It's nice to be able to use a similar kind of colour so you get that little bit more red on there, but have them different enough that you can tell that they're not the same. So the next highlight is going to be Citadel Squig Orange. There's going to be a bit more of an extreme highlight just on the areas that be catching the most light, and that'll just make those stand out a little bit more. Don't forget to do this on his hat and also the little bandana too. We can move on to the next colour. So next up, we're going to work on a little bit on the flesh. We're going to use some Citadel Kislev flesh and just start reapplying the colour to him. Now, there's a bit of a mess up in order here. We're going to go from Kislev flesh to a few different colours, then return to his skin a little bit later on. So just get this Kislev flesh down. Make sure you're highlighting some of those details, like you can see his collarbones a little bit, and also some of the little bits in his neck, I suppose tendons in his throat and what have you. And also the raised areas on his face, to make sure that they're brightened up from the shade. Now we're going to go through his stockings. We're going to use some vallejo ivory and reapply some of the colour on this. Now you want to think about where the shape of the knee and the shape of the leg is going to affect how it catches the light, and how it's tighter over those areas and where the creases are, and get those creases highlighted too. Lumps and bumps around the knee. And also think about around the ankle and where the ankle bulges out as well at either side, and where the Achilles runs down the back of the foot as well. With these highlighted, we're now going to use a little bit of vallejo white and just highlight the stockings. Not too much, because you do still want to have that slightly off-white colour to them, because that'll make them stand out against the white of his shirt, where we shaded with the apothecary white earlier. But enough so that you do get the highlight on the stockings. Now it's going to be vallejo white again. I'm going to start working on his shirt. So when you're doing the shirt again, you're thinking about the creases and where the creases are on it. We're only going to do one highlight because we've gone from white, apothecary white, to shade it, and then we're just going to go and do the white back on it to highlight it again, bring a bit of colour back to it. So you can leave the apothecary white in the recesses where you want the shade to be on his shirt. If you don't have the apothecary white contrast, I do recommend it. It's really good for shading on white. Now we're going to use some vallejo German grey and highlight his shorts, or his pants. They're pretty short though. Here you want to be thinking about where's going to be catching the light. So again, you're not going to be doing this layer down underneath his legs, just catching the tops of the ridges and any of the ridges which may go under the legs slightly, but leaving the under the legs mainly black and leaving black just in the recesses too. Once you've finished those, we'll come back for the next highlight, and that is going to be using Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey. You're just going to do really thin extreme highlights on each of the creases, again like you did on the shirt earlier and the sash, just to bring out some of the little ridges, the details in the material. Once you've finished that, we can move on to Citadel Retributor Armour. I'm going to reapply some colour to that gold. I mentioned before, if you haven't shaded the gold, use some Citadel Wazdakka shade to shade it. When that's dry, come back and just use the Retributor Armour again. It's just to reapply some of the colour back to the gold, making sure you leave that Wazdakka shade in the recesses so you get that nice dark shade on the undersides and in the ridges. Just add some little bits of Retributor Armour back to this, making sure you leave some of the bits shaded too. So we're going to highlight the gold using some Citadel Liberator gold. You're not going to do this all over, just sort of on the extreme edges and maybe a little bit near the top of the end of the scabbard. And a little bit more on the guard of his sword too, just to lighten that up where the light will be catching it. Also, you can add some to the top edges of the buttons. Now we've added a little bit of vallejo model air chrome to the Liberator gold. We're just going to do one final highlight, a little extreme highlight mainly on the edges, just to make them stand out a little bit more. So do a tiny spot on each of the buttons and just the edges and some of the angles on the scabbard too. Like so. Now I'm going to go back to the skin, so we're going to use some Kislev flesh and mix a little bit of vallejo white in with the Kislev flesh just to give that a little bit of a lighter shade. Now we're just going to highlight the skin that we painted earlier. Now because you've got little details on there like the collarbones and stuff like that, you really can make them stand out so that you can see all the details on his chest there. Also on his face, you're thinking about the cheekbones, the chin, where he's going to be catching the light on his nose, between the nose there too. Then we're going to add a little bit more white to the previous mix and just do one final highlight on him. Doing a little bit of work on the hands here because you couldn't really see the hands in the last part. So you want to get the highlights on those joints and then on the tendons going down the back of the hands as well, just to make them stand out a little bit. And same on the other hand. And do final highlights on the face. If that, use a Army Painter Wargamer character brush. It's got a really fine point and it allows you to do those details no problem. So now we're actually doing the same layer as we've just done on the hands, but I've just thought to put an extra bit on to show you doing the face too. So this is the same shade like the second highlight that we did on the hands there. We're just going to do this on the face using the thinner brush and just pick out those details on the face. Like so. So now we're going to use a little bit of vallejo white. We're going to use this to paint his eyes. We're using the Army Painter Wargamer character brush again. So when you're doing the eyes, you want to get a tiny little bit of paint on the brush and you want to be dragging it from the nose towards the side of the head to get those eyes on. If you go straight at it, the brush will bend when you're tapping on the eye and you'll get those funny shaped eyes or splodges of paint. But if you drag it from the centre by the nose out towards the sides, you'll get a far better eye shape. Now we're just going to use a tiny little bit of vallejo black just to put a little spot in there. Again, you try and get that on an angle. If you try and poke it on there, sometimes you will just splot the pupil so it gets a bit of a funny shape, a bit like that one, which is slightly bigger than the one on the other side, so now I'm just going to use a tiny little bit of white and shrink that pupil down a little bit, like so. So with the eyes done, now I'm going to just add a little bit of detail to his sword. We're going to reapply some Citadel Leadbelcher, not to the whole sword, just mainly to the edges and towards the tip, where you want to have a nice little bit of shine on there to make it stand out. Like so. Now we're going to use a tiny little bit of vallejo model air chrome just to add some scrapes and scratches to that blade, and also to go along the sword edge, just to make that stand out and make it look a little bit sharper. Now I'm going to use Leadbelcher just to do those little rivets on his base. There's about 5 or 6 of them on there, so you can pick them out. That'll just mean that all the colours are on the base ready for us to start shading it and getting that looking like wood. So next up we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Dryad bark. I'm just going to reapply a little bit of colour to the pistol grips sticking out of his sash there. A lot of little cool details on these. I really do like the Blood and Plunder models. A lot of character to each one of them. So now I'm going to add a little bit of Citadel Mournfang brown just to give a slightly more lighter part to it. I was thinking of the handles, the dark and the light wood. So it's kind of like that kind of almost chestnut look to them. So I thought I'd use a little bit of the Mournfang brown just to add those little bits of colour to it. You can also use this to highlight the scabbard and the leather too. I'm going to add a little bit of Citadel Rakarth flesh to the Mournfang brown and do one final little edge highlight on the leather, make it look a little bit chafed and scraped. And also add a few little highlights to the handles of those pistols. So now onto Rakarth flesh. We're just going to start reapplying this to his hair. So you want to make sure you're leaving that Kasandora yellow in all the recesses on his hair. And just get the Rakarth flesh on those longer strands to make it stand out and give it that kind of blondish look. Now we're going to start working on those floorboards. I'm going to reapply some Baneblade brown. Now using a brush with a decent point on this. So I'm using a Citadel medium layer brush, a newer one where the point's still pretty good. And we're just doing all of the painting in the same direction as the grain of the wood. So you want to be doing it end to end rather than side to side. If you do it side to side, it loses that kind of wood effect, I find. So if you're doing it end to end, you're highlighting the grain on it. It makes it stand out that little bit more. Now I'm going to mix some Citadel Zandri dust with the Baneblade brown. This just to give that a slight yellowy colour. And then we're going to start highlighting the wood. Again, although you can't see it here, we're following the grain of the wood, going end to end, leaving some of the Baneblade brown on show. That is some terrible camera work, that, sorry about that. Hopefully you see a little bit here. You're basically just highlighting the wood and the areas that you painted the Baneblade brown on. Now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Agraxair shade. I'm just going to go around the edges of some of the planks and put some of this in the deeper recesses. And this just means that the details on the wood will stand out that little bit more. Also, you want to do almost like a little circle around each of the bolts which are going through. You don't have to paint it on as a circle, you can just get a little bit on the brush and kind of put that over the top of it. As long as you've got the slightly darker bits where if they varnish the wood or there's any dirt or grime, that will build up around the bolts. I'm using a tiny little bit of Citadel Rightland Flesh Shade. I'm just going to apply some of that to a few little areas of the gaps in the planks and the details, just to give them a slightly different tone. You're not doing it to all of it, it's just to add a little bit more of a shade to certain areas, like so. And that is the finished Laurens de Graaf. A great miniature to paint, a lot of fun and a lot of cool details. Also handy in a scrap in Blood and Plunder. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media, linked below. Thanks very much. If you like the channel and enjoy the content and you'd like to support us, please head to our coffee page where you can buy us a brew. Thanks very much.